All right, this is going to be a lesson on natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. We're going to start talking a little bit about Darwin, get into the different aspects of natural selection, talk about microevolution, and then move from there into adaptation, speciation, and macroevolution. All right, so let's get started with a quote from Charles Darwin himself. He said lots of things, but one was, "One general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die." And I like this one because there's some key words here that really relate to the science behind natural selection overall. Multiply. Natural selection requires reproduction. Vary. It also requires genetic variation. And the strongest live and the weakest die. That's sort of the idea of survival of the fittest. So it means that the environment is going to impart a situation where some traits are more fit than others. And so that's where we're going to talk more about each of those premises. All right, so natural selection. It requires that a certain number of things be true, and it's also the observation of these different things that led Charles Darwin to kind of coin the phrase and observe the process. Organisms produce large numbers of offspring so that some will survive. So the majority of organisms produce a lot more offspring than actually survive to reproductive age. This is required because otherwise you can't have selective survival. If they produced a number of offsprings that didn't make it a challenge to survive, then there wouldn't be any selection. So this idea of a production of larger numbers than what the environment can actually support. And this also gets to multiply because it is talking about production and reproduction. There's variation in the traits of offspring. Selection, the selection word in natural selection, is about the environment selecting for traits. Now, the environment isn't conscious, so it's not something that's intentional per se, but it just sort of is. For example, if you move up the East Coast, the squirrels get larger. So the squirrels down here are smaller. And then, I'm from North Carolina, our squirrels were a little larger. And as you move further up and you get in Canada, their squirrels are much larger. The reason for that is the squirrels that are down here wouldn't be able to survive the cooler temperatures because they wouldn't have adequate body fat. So it's not better everywhere. It's not better or worse, generally speaking. It has everything to do with the environment that the organism is in. So the fatter squirrels are more fit in the cooler environments. The thinner, smaller squirrels are more fit in the warmer environments. So the variation in size is what then allows for the environment to select the more fit of those variations. Organisms with traits that improve the chances of survival reproduce. So in order to reproduce, you have to be alive. Dead things don't reproduce. So survival first, reproduction second. I know I made the joke in class several times that your main goal every day, your body's main goal every day is don't die. And then after that, especially in the reproductive age, it's to reproduce. So don't die, spread your genes. That's pretty much the primary goals of life. But there's no reproduction if an organism doesn't make it to reproductive age. So survival and reproduction are both required. And the ability of an organism in a given environment, remember, it's not just the organism, the environment is key. It's the interaction between the organism and the environment, or populations of organisms and the environment, that is natural selection. So fitness then is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. All right, so a lot of people can get confused between natural selection and evolution. Are they the same? Are they different? How does that work? Well, natural selection drives evolutionary change. So evolution, by definition, is simply change over time. And specifically, it's the change of allelic frequency. So remember that term allele, those are the different variations of a gene. So allelic frequency is how much of certain alleles are showing up in a population. And we'll talk more about this as we move through the lesson. But for now, it's change over time. So in order for evolution, or that change over time of alleles to occur, natural selection has to occur. So natural selection drives evolutionary change. So the relationship between the variations of traits and the environmental pressures determine over time what the allelic frequency of a population is. So what alleles are showing up. And that's the relationship between natural selection and evolution. So again, circling back a bit here, natural selection requires overproduction of offspring, meaning that there are more organisms produced by way of reproduction than what the environment can actually support, which means there's going to be competition for resources, and also depending on whether or not the organism is a prey or a predator. Predators are limited by the availability of food. Prey are often limited by the fact that they are food. So variations in traits can make organisms more or less likely to get food, more or less likely to get shelter, more or less likely to get a mate. And, in addition to being alive, you also have to get someone who's willing in order for reproduction to occur. And then if an organism survives to reproductive age and has a mate to reproduce with, those are ultimately the traits that are going to be passed on. So heritability of traits, it wouldn't really matter so much that certain organisms were surviving better than others. It wouldn't drive change, except that the traits that that organism has are going to be passed to its offspring. So thus, the traits in those that are surviving, so the survivors, and they're also reproducing, they're just going to increase each generation. Right? And because then they're going to have more offspring. And so that's going to be that evolutionary change over time. All right, looking at this a little more closely and looking at some examples. So for example, in fish, and this is pretty much in all types of fish, they lay a ton of eggs, and some of them are going to survive and some of them are not. And the question that's posed right here is, which population will likely lead to a struggle for survival? Well, it's going to be this one, this larger population, because you're going to, if you've got the same amount of food that you're competing for, well, it's going to have to be spread a lot further, and some of these fish in this larger population are not going to have enough to eat, and as a result, they're going to die, or there's not going to be enough shelter if they're a prey species, and some of these guys hanging out on the outside aren't going to be hidden well, and a bigger fish is going to come along. And you know how that goes. It's going to eat them up. And so the larger the population, this overproduction is going to create more pressure from the environment on those different variation of traits to survive to reproductive age. All right, limited resources. So that's what I was getting at here. So here you've got a really simplified example of a species of organism or a population of organisms. And you can see there's variation in color. And they're going to be competing for food, space, and mates. So not all of these individuals are going to make it. Some of them are going to get enough to eat, some of them are going to have a place to hide, and some of them, even if they get all of that, won't have the right qualities to attract a mate. The ones that do have the right traits to be able to compete well for food and habitat and to attract a mate, those are the ones that are going to reproduce, and those are the genes that are going to be passed on. All right, so again, just another way to look at this. So here you've got an example of a butterfly, and you've got variation in color. So some are yellow, and some are brown, and we just did that big unit on genetics, so you know that this type of thing, details about how it is inherited. So these are inherited traits. So there's overproduction of offspring, and meaning that not all that are produced are going to be able to survive. And then this is a prey species, so here it's showing the adaptation. So in this example, the caterpillars, the brown caterpillars are blending in better with the log, and so they're less likely to be eaten by the birds. And you're going to look at an example of moths and also the rock pocket mouse in the lab. So you'll see examples of microevolution that relate to this same idea of a prey species and how well it can be camouflaged or blend in with its environment. So it turns out that the favorable trait, or the fit trait in this case, is the brown coloring. Why? It's just because of the environment. The environment has a brown bark, and birds are picking off the brown caterpillars less as a result. And you can see over here, it's selecting for brown, and the population is going to become more and more brown over time. So over generations, a change in allele frequency, meaning that you've got more of the brown allele than the yellow allele at this point. A commonly used term when we talk about natural selection and evolution is adaptation. Adaptation is a change in the structure, function, or behavior that improves an individual's chance of survival in a specific environment. One of the most common misunderstandings of adaptation, and I think it's because of the common use of the word, is that an individual cannot adapt. biologically speaking, so in biology, from a scientific perspective, as far as you in this lesson are concerned, in biology, an individual cannot adapt. Why? Because adaptation from a biological perspective requires reproduction, allelic variation, so variation in alleles, and a population of organisms. I'm sorry if you can hear the background noise. I am as far across the house as I can get, but the whole neighborhood is in my pool. Population of organisms, and it's over generations. I mean, it's not really the whole neighborhood, but it's 4 kids. Only 2 of them are mine. And my kids, I thought they were the loudest, but I'm beginning to think maybe the kids down the street are even louder. But hopefully it won't be too much of a distraction if you can hear it at all. I'll try not to get too distracted as well. So adaptation from a biological perspective requires reproduction, allelic variation, population of organisms, and generations. We use the term commonly, oh, well, you'll adapt. I mean, you go to a new school, move to a new state, oh, well, you'll adapt. And there's similar meaning, but it isn't the same. And the word adaptation in biology can only be achieved by a change in alleles of a population of organisms over a long period of time, so generations. So just make sure that you don't get confused there. Oh, good grief. I'm sorry, but I don't want to have to re-record this, so I apologize for the interruption of the phone. I'll turn the ringer off, and we're just going to keep moving forward. I had a hard enough time finding a good opportunity to do this, so we're just going to keep moving forward. All right, so individuals do not adapt, populations do. And I just explained that. When natural selection acts on a population over time, certain advantageous traits become more common and the population becomes better suited to its environment. So in the example that we just looked at, the brown butterfly, or the brown caterpillar rather, was more well camouflaged. So the population would be whatever the type of butterflies. So the species of butterfly in that area would be the population in this example. And over time requires generations. How many generations can depend on the size of the population. Certain advantageous traits. In the case of the butterfly, it was brown coloring, really more for the caterpillar, become more common, and that's what we saw. And the population becomes better suited to its environment. Why is it better suited? Well, in that example, it was because of camouflage. Now, generally speaking, is brown color better than yellow? Well, no, not necessarily. If there were trees that appeared more yellow, then it would have gone the other way. So again, it's dependent upon the environment, what is and is not more fit or selected for. The environmental pressure in this case was predation. So the birds looking for the caterpillars as food leads to differential survival. The brown caterpillars survived better. And differential reproduction, because they were alive, the brown reproduced more. And so now that would be considered an adaptation. The brown color would be an adaptation of a population over generations. And you could look at several examples and kind of work through the same thing, but that relates to the example we just looked at. All right, so a little bit more about what a population is. So we said an individual doesn't adapt, a population does. Well, a population, by definition, is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area at the same time. So it's important to distinguish here. All of the great white sharks in the world would not be a population. All of the great white sharks in a given area, so you could say maybe all of the great white sharks in the southeastern Atlantic, that would be a population. So the organisms have to be the same species, but they also have to be in the same area. Why is the same species important? Well, the whole reproduction piece, passing on of genes, that requires the same species. Living in the same area, well, that's the environmental pressures. Organisms that aren't living in the same area may not have the same environmental pressures, and as a result may have different changes. And so we look at, when we talk about natural selection, we talk about populations because that's what's relevant. Organisms that, great white sharks across the world from each other aren't reproducing. They are reproducing with organisms of the same species in the same general area that are affected by the same environmental pressures. And so what you're seeing in this really simple schematic is different. This would be a marine environment, and there, all the octopus in a general region, seahorses, sharks, crabs, etc. The other example down here is showing how two really similar types of organisms can be in different species if they are not in the same area. So in this example, they're separated by this mountain, and because of this separation, they don't interbreed and may be under different environmental pressures. So they're in separate populations. So it's important to understand what a population is, because that's the unit that natural selection is going to act on over generations of time. All right, so this is looking at it in a different way. So the variation that's required, where does that come from? It comes from mutation. It also comes from independent assortment. Remember that we learned about that last unit, how the traits from parents are arranged differently each time. Also crossing over. So there's lots of different things that can impart genetic variation. But mutation's one example. So you've got one type, mutation creates variation. Well, then there's an unfavorable mutation that is selected against. So in the example that we just looked at, that would have been the yellow. And reproduction and mutation continue to occur. So these two survived in that generation and then reproduced here, and you've got a little bit more variation and change. And so this is the change over multiple generations that can occur. And again, it's change of alleles. All right, so a little more here on adaptation, and this is showing another adaptation of camouflage in a moth in the image. So organisms must be adapted to the environment that they live in so they can obtain food and water, survive in the climate, be safe from danger, and have the space and opportunity to reproduce. And if you take an organism from like a polar environment and put them in a tropical environment or vice versa, just imagine putting a polar bear in Jamaica or a tropical fish in the Arctic. I mean, the colors, it would stand out. It wouldn't even make any sense. And so just by thinking in those simple ways, you can start to understand the relationship between the adaptations of populations of organisms and the way that they relate to their environment. So here is an example talking about owls, just all owls generally speaking here. So here's some adaptations of owls. Totally silent flight. This is important for survival because the silent flight allows them to sneak up on their prey. They have fringed flight feathers that muffle the sound of air passing through their feathers. So that resulted from, some mutation or change in alleles that made the organisms that had it more likely to survive because it was easier for them to capture their prey. And as a result, it stayed in the allelic pool for owls. Large eyes set forward on the head gives great depth perception for hunting, plus the retinas of their eyes are packed with low light sensitive rods, which makes them able to hunt at night, again allowing them even more possibility to sneak up on their prey and giving them protection from humans and any other potential predators or really just nuisances when they're hunting. They also have all that extra neck flexibility, which allows them to better follow their prey as they're hunting, and sharp talons for catching prey on the fly. So quick, they can snatch them right up. They also do the whole pelleting thing so that they're able to digest the animal whole. There's even more adaptations that aren't mentioned here, but you can just choose an organism. You can even choose one that you regularly see out in nature in the environment and think about how its form is related to how it functions in its environment and how does it use these different things to survive. All right, so then a recap here. Charles Darwin first proposed natural selection in the 1850s. And again, it's just the process by which organisms with characteristics that are suited to a certain ecosystem. And remember, that's just the certain ecosystem is that a specific environmental pressures that a population of organisms is exposed to. And they're going to have a better chance of surviving and reproducing than organisms that do not have that particular set of characteristics. The genes already need to be in the population for this to occur. So again, the individual can't evolve or adapt. The genes don't just show up. They have to be in the population, or a mutation has to occur in order for those alleles to be available. And natural selection causes or drives evolution. So here's an example with antibiotics. This is why it's so important to take all of your antibiotics when you are prescribed them. So it's showing here pre-antibiotic, there's a bacteria which the majority of them are not resistant, but there's a couple that are. Now, if you take your antibiotic the way you're supposed to, most times your immune system will be able to knock out what's remaining. So because as you can see, the resistant ones are less prevalent. With the antibiotic, you're going to knock out the non-resistant ones. But if you start feeling better, but you've still got a good number of the resistant bacteria present, then they're able to reproduce. And then that's how you end up with a strain with more antibiotic resistance. And that's what's happened, which has had such a huge impact on drugs like penicillin. And these are examples, what I just explained to you, and the example with the butterflies. And you're also going to look at 2 examples of microevolution with the rock pocket mouse and the peppered moth through the lab. Microevolution is the evolutionary change within a species of a small group of organisms, especially over a short period. So if you're able to observe it as a human being, or even as a couple generations of human beings, then it's microevolution. Micro meaning small, because evolution is a huge concept, and because it has to happen over generations, especially depending on the type of organism and how long that organism lives and how long it takes for them to get to reproductive age, it can be difficult to observe anything that isn't microevolution, but microevolution can be observed. And here's just another example. It doesn't say what the mutation is in this case, but looking at the alleles that are being expressed. So it's showing that there's a beneficial mutation, which wasn't really prevalent, but then it became more prevalent in the 2nd generation, even more prevalent in the 3rd generation, and unless the environment changes in the next generation, it will be even more prevalent, and that will continue to happen over time. All right, so most of what made sense to Darwin and most of what makes sense to us when we think of survival of the fittest is strongest, keenest in finding food, best at hiding, those types of things. But there were a couple of instances where Darwin was just perplexed or dumbfounded, and one of those was peacocks. Peacocks don't make any sense with regard to survival. They're not a predatory species, they're a prey species. So why would a prey species have this really elaborate set of feathers where they basically puff it out and say, look at me, here I am, come find me? And it even weighs the peacock down, makes it harder for them to fly, all that additional weight. It's really hard to figure out why that would remain in populations, because clearly it doesn't help them find food. It doesn't help them evade predators. So what the heck? And this is the other key, sexual selection. So natural selection is focused primarily on traits that lead to better survival, and by way of being alive, more reproduction, but there's also sexual selection. So in this case, the male, and in most bird species, and I'll show you some more pictures on the next slide, the female chooses the male based on some type of display. And it turns out there is some relevance to this. If a bird has a lot of parasites, they're not going to be able to pull off these bright colors. It can also be related to immunity. And so there is some real connection to physiological benefits, but it's remained because the prettier this plume, the more likely the bird is to reproduce. So the whole survival thing is only relevant with regard to changing allele frequencies over time if the survivor is reproducing. And so that's where sexual selection comes in. And there's examples in a lot of different types of organisms. And if you think as a human being, although we're pretty preference oriented, there still are some pretty basic sexual selection things with us. And it's interesting to look those up. But in birds is where it is most prominent. So here's some other examples. The cardinal is one that we're pretty familiar with because we have cardinals around. And if you know about cardinals, you know that the male has this really beautiful bright red, and the female, so this is the male, and the female kind of has more bland coloring. The reason is there's no need for her to have the bright coloring. It does make him more visible to a predator, and he doesn't care what she looks like. She's the one choosing. She's the one getting to choose who gets to mate and who doesn't. So she will choose based on how brightly and pretty the color of the male is. So as a result, that bright red color has been prevalent. Down here, this crazy looking like it looks like a light show. This one here, that is a bird of paradise. Now look at the difference in the male and the female there. I mean, they look completely different. That's the male with his feathers spread out, and he's showing these dots that are on his head. and he's doing a dance with those crazy colors. Like that is, and there's some neat videos. If you look up David Attenborough Birds of Paradise or just Sexual Selection Birds of Paradise on YouTube, you can see these birds actually doing the whole dance and everything. It's pretty amazing. But again, the colors wouldn't be that vibrant without the health of the bird. So there's that connection there. Two of my favorites are the blue-footed booby, just because, I mean, look how cute they are. So they do a little dance where they lift up their blue feet. Now, in this case, both the male and the female have the blue feet, but they lift up their blue feet and do a little dance. And again, the healthier the bird, the more vibrant the color of blue. But that has become sexual selection as well with the blue feet. And this guy up in the upper right corner, this is a bowerbird. They are really neat. They actually will create these shelters that are just beautiful. So in this case, this bird has chosen different trash, but all in the shade of blue, and he's decorating this area to attract a mate. I've seen it done with flower petals. They will also stack up nuts and make towers, and you can see how he's kind of cleared out and stacked the grass there as well. The bowerbirds, they're just amazing. Well, I can see by the time where I am, I was hoping I'd get this into one video, but I'm not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to stop here and I will pick up with a second lesson to finish out macroevolution.